I was sitting in my kitchen, still in my black dress from Jake's funeral, when my phone buzzed with a text from my son Mark. "Mom, pack light for Florida. One small bag only. We'll handle everything else." The message felt cold, but I trusted him. After 42 years of marriage, I was drowning in grief and desperate for any lifeline my family could offer. 2 weeks later, Mark handed me my boarding pass at Nashville International Airport. I stared at the ticket. One way only. "Where's my return flight?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not coming back with us," Tanya said flatly, not even looking up from her phone. "Figure it out yourself." They walked toward their gate without another word. I stood there, abandoned in a sea of strangers, clutching my purse with shaking hands. 42 years of devotion, decades of Sunday dinners, birthday gifts, and unconditional love. All dismissed in 10 seconds. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. Then I remembered something Jake and I had hidden years ago, something they knew nothing about. But there was something else they didn't know about me. My name is Blake, and I was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. Standing there in that terminal, clutching my purse with $960 hidden in a secret compartment Jake and I had sewn into the lining years ago, I felt the full weight of what I had sacrificed for this moment. Just 2 weeks earlier, I had sold my grandmother's pearl necklace to a pawn shop on Broadway for $320. The man behind the counter barely looked up as he weighed those pearls that had graced 3 generations of women in my family. "Best I can do," he had said, sliding the cash across the scratched glass counter. I remember walking out of that shop feeling like I had traded away a piece of my soul, but I told myself it was worth it. Family comes first. Family always comes first. That had been my motto for 42 years of marriage to Jake and 28 years of being Mark's mother. I had also parted with my wedding ring that same afternoon, the simple gold band that Jake had slipped onto my finger at the courthouse in 1981. We were both 23 then, full of dreams and completely broke. That ring represented a promise that lasted through everything. His 2 layoffs in the 90s, my mother's long illness, Mark's rebellious teenage years, and all those quiet Sunday mornings when we read the newspaper together over coffee. The jeweler on Commerce Street gave me $480 for it, explaining that gold prices were down, but the craftsmanship was solid. I nodded and signed the paperwork, telling myself that Jake would understand. He always understood when I put family first. The third sacrifice had been the hardest. Jake's toolbox, the red Craftsman set he had assembled piece by piece over 30 years. Every socket wrench, every screwdriver, every level had a story. The box itself was dented and worn, covered with stickers from job sites across Tennessee. After Jake's stroke took him so suddenly, I would sometimes go to the garage just to touch those tools, to smell the faint scent of motor oil and sawdust that still lingered on the handles. But Mark had mentioned casually that the Florida trip would cost more than expected, especially with the kids wanting to visit Disney World. So I posted the toolbox on Facebook Marketplace and sold it to a contractor from Murfreesboro for $210. He came to the house on a Thursday morning, loaded it into his truck, and drove away with the last physical reminder of my husband's working hands. The morning Jake died replays in my mind with perfect clarity, each detail preserved like a photograph that never fades. It was a Tuesday, the kind of gray March day where the rain comes down steady and soft, pattering against the kitchen windows. Jake had gotten up early, as he always did, padding barefoot across the hardwood floors to start the coffee. I remember lying in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his morning routine, the grind of the coffee beans, the whistle of the kettle, the gentle clink of ceramic mugs against the counter. These were the sounds of a marriage, the daily symphony that had played in our house for 4 decades. Then there was silence, not the comfortable quiet of a man lost in thought, but something wrong, something final. I called his name twice before getting up to check. I found him collapsed beside the coffee maker, the carafe shattered on the floor, dark liquid mixing with rainwater that had somehow tracked in from our leaky back door. His face was peaceful, almost surprised, as if death had tapped him on the shoulder when he wasn't looking. The paramedics said later that the stroke had been massive and instantaneous. No suffering, they assured me, no time for fear or pain. Just gone. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Visitors came and went, bringing casseroles and condolences, their voices mixing into a hum of sympathy that I couldn't quite absorb. I remember sitting in our living room during the visitation, watching neighbors and friends tell stories about Jake that I had heard 100 times before, but somehow they sounded different now, like echoes from a life that no longer existed. Mark and Tanya had handled most of the arrangements, which I was grateful for then. They chose the funeral home, selected the casket, wrote the obituary that appeared in the Tennessean. All I had to do was show up and nod when people shook my hand and said Jake was in a better place now. But the real grief began after everyone left. When the house settled back into its new, terrible quiet, I would wake up at 5:30 every morning, Jake's usual time, and for just a moment I would expect to hear the coffee grinder downstairs. Instead, there was nothing. The silence was so complete it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I stopped cooking real meals, living instead on crackers and canned soup, eating standing up at the kitchen counter like a woman who had forgotten she owned a dining room table. The mailbox filled up with sympathy cards and bills I couldn't bring myself to open. The garden Jake had tended so carefully began to wilt and brown, accusatory in its neglect. It was during one of these hollow days, maybe 3 weeks after the funeral, that Mark called with the Florida idea. I remember I was sitting on the couch, still in the same nightgown I had worn for 2 days, staring at a photograph of Jake from our last anniversary. The phone rang, and Mark's voice was unusually warm, almost cheerful. "Mom, Tanya and I have been talking," he said, "and we think you need a change of scenery. How would you like to come to Florida with us next month? We're taking the kids to see Mickey Mouse, and we thought you might enjoy the sunshine." The offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than emptiness. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of it. That phone call marked the beginning of my transformation back into someone who might want to leave the house, who might care about what she wore or whether her hair was combed. I started small, a shower every day, real food heated in the microwave, phone calls returned. The Florida trip became my focal point, something to plan for and look forward to. When Mark mentioned that money would be tight with 4 plane tickets and a week at Disney, I didn't hesitate to start liquidating our possessions. Jake would have wanted me to be with family, I told myself. He would have understood that things are just things, but memories with grandchildren last forever. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly Mark and Tanya had orchestrated my isolation. It started even before Jake died, with little changes so gradual I barely noticed them. Sunday dinners that got canceled more often, holiday visits that grew shorter, phone calls that became less frequent and more perfunctory. After Jake's funeral, they ramped up their strategy. Mark would call every few days, just long enough to check that I was still breathing and hadn't set the house on fire, but never long enough for real conversation. When I tried to tell him about missing Jake, about the loneliness that felt like a living thing gnawing at my bones, he would cut me off with practical suggestions. "Maybe you should join a senior center, Mom," he would say, or, "Have you thought about getting a cat?" Tanya was more direct in her dismissal. During one visit, maybe 6 weeks after the funeral, she walked through my house like a real estate appraiser, commenting on how much space I was wasting, how impractical it was for a woman my age to maintain such a large property. "You should really think about downsizing," she said, running her finger along the dining room table to check for dust. "All this stuff is just going to be a burden eventually. Better to deal with it now while you can still make rational decisions." At the time, her words stung, but I convinced myself she was being practical, maybe even caring in her own blunt way. Now I understand she was conducting reconnaissance, cataloging assets, and testing my resistance to manipulation. The Florida trip was the perfect trap, really. They had studied my weaknesses, my desperate need for family connection, my willingness to sacrifice for others, my naive trust in their good intentions. They knew I would liquidate anything to be included, to feel wanted and valued again. The request for money came wrapped in family togetherness, presented as my contribution to creating magical memories with my grandchildren. How could I refuse? What kind of grandmother puts her own financial security above her family's happiness? So I became complicit in my own financial bleeding. Every item I sold, every dollar I contributed, was another thread in the web they were weaving around me. The pearl necklace funded their first-class upgrades. The wedding ring paid for their hotel suite. Jake's tools covered their rental car and dining expenses. I was financing my own abandonment, purchasing my own betrayal with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. The cruelest part was how grateful I felt to be contributing, how proud I was to be able to help. I was like a lamb walking cheerfully to slaughter, thanking the butcher for showing me the way. The pattern extended beyond money, of course. They had been training me to accept smaller and smaller portions of respect, dignity, and consideration. Holiday seating arrangements where I was relegated to the children's table, supposedly because it was cozier. Birthday celebrations where my preferences were ignored in favor of whatever was most convenient for them. Conversations where my opinions were dismissed or ignored entirely, where I was treated like a pleasant but ultimately irrelevant background figure. They were slowly erasing my identity as a fully realized person, reducing me to a collection of resources to be managed and eventually depleted. I remember one particularly painful example from the previous Christmas. Tanya had insisted on cooking dinner at their house instead of mine, breaking a 20-year tradition. When I offered to bring my famous pecan pie, the dessert Jake always said was better than his own mother's, Tanya waved me off. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said. "I'll just pick something up from the bakery." It's easier that way. Easier for whom, I wondered, but I didn't argue. I showed up empty-handed for the first time in decades, feeling like a guest at my own family gathering. The store-bought pie was mediocre at best, nothing like the recipe I had perfected over 40 years of trial and error. But no one seemed to notice or care. I sat at their table, eating inferior dessert and smiling while my heart broke a little more. The financial abuse had been gradual too, almost invisible in its subtlety. Mark had started asking for small loans years ago. $50 here, $100 there, always with promises to pay me back that somehow never materialized. When Jake was alive, he would gently discourage these requests, pointing out that Mark and Tanya both had good jobs and should be able to manage their own expenses. But after Jake died, Mark's requests became more frequent and more substantial. Car repairs, medical bills, unexpected expenses that always seemed to arise just when I was feeling most vulnerable and desperate for connection. Each time I wrote a check, I told myself I was helping family, investing in relationships that would sustain me through my grief. But now, standing in that airport terminal with their airplane disappearing into the distance, I could finally see the truth. I hadn't been helping family. I had been funding a long-term strategy to separate me from my resources while maintaining plausible deniability. Every dollar I gave them was a dollar I wouldn't have for my own needs, making me more dependent on their goodwill, more willing to accept crumbs of attention and affection. They were systematically impoverishing me, both financially and emotionally, creating conditions where abandonment would seem like a mercy rather than a cruelty. The realization hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over with its intensity. This wasn't just garden-variety selfishness or thoughtlessness. This was calculated financial abuse, elder exploitation carried out by the people who were supposed to love and protect me most. They had weaponized my grief, my loneliness, my desire to be useful and valued. They had turned my greatest strengths, my generosity, my loyalty, my willingness to sacrifice for others, into instruments of my own destruction. But as I sat there in that hard plastic chair, feeling the weight of the emergency money in my purse, I realized something else. They had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that Jake and I were the kind of people who lived paycheck to paycheck, who had nothing significant set aside for emergencies or opportunities. They were wrong, dead wrong, and that mistake was going to cost them everything they thought they were so cleverly positioning themselves to inherit. The decision to act came to me with startling clarity, like a fog lifting to reveal a landscape that had been there all along. I was done being a victim, done being managed and manipulated and slowly bled dry by people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. If they wanted to treat me like I was already dead, fine. I would give them exactly what they wanted, but on my terms, not theirs. I pulled out my phone and started searching for lawyers in Nashville. The first 2 firms I called were closed for the day, their voicemails promising to return calls during normal business hours. The third call connected me to a human being, a receptionist with a kind voice, who listened patiently as I explained that I needed to make some urgent changes to my estate planning. "How soon can I see someone?" I asked, and she must have heard something in my voice because she didn't give me the usual runaround about scheduling several weeks out. "Let me check with Mr. Monroe," she said. "Can you hold for just a moment?" The music that played while I waited was some generic classical piece, probably meant to be soothing, but I barely heard it. My mind was racing ahead, making plans and calculations, feeling more alive and focused than I had in months. When she came back on the line, her voice was warmer than before. "Mr. Monroe can see you first thing tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Will that work for you?" I told her it would work perfectly, and she gave me the address on Church Street, along with instructions about what documents to bring. After I hung up, I sat for a moment, feeling something I hadn't experienced since Jake died, a sense of purpose, of agency, of being in control of my own destiny. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of taking back my life. Tonight, I would check into a modest motel near the airport and start planning the systematic dismantling of my son's expectations. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my body humming with the kind of nervous energy I remembered from my wedding day 4 decades earlier. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing the navy blue suit I had worn to Jake's funeral. It felt appropriate somehow, like I was burying one version of myself and preparing to resurrect another. The law office of Monroe and Wade occupied the 3rd floor of an elegant brick building downtown, the kind of place that announced competence and discretion with its understated decor and expensive carpet. James Monroe himself was a man in his early 50s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He listened without interruption as I told him about the airport abandonment, about the pattern of financial requests and emotional neglect, about my decision to cut Mark and Tanya out of my will entirely. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and studied me for a long moment. "Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, "I want to make sure you understand that this is a decision you can't easily undo. Once we revise your will and put certain protections in place, it will be very difficult for your son to challenge them, even if you change your mind later." I met his gaze steadily. "Mr. Monroe, I've been married for 42 years and been a mother for 28. I've made thousands of decisions based on what other people needed from me. This is the first decision I'm making based purely on what I need for myself. I'm not going to change my mind." He nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with my resolve, and we spent the next hour going through my assets in detail. The house Jake and I had bought in 1985, now worth nearly $400,000. The life insurance policy that had paid out $250,000 after his death. The savings account we had built up over decades of careful living, currently holding just over $180,000. The investment portfolio Jake had managed so carefully, now worth close to $300,000. The total came to just over $1.1 million, a number that would have seemed impossible to the young couple who had started out in a 1-bedroom apartment with nothing but love and determination. Jake would have been proud of what we had accomplished together, and I knew he would support what I was about to do with it. Instead of leaving everything to Mark and Tanya, who clearly saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their windfall, I would donate the bulk of my estate to Elder Haven, an organization that provided support and advocacy for seniors who had been abandoned or abused by their families. The new will took shape slowly and deliberately, each clause crafted to express my values and protect my legacy. Elder Haven would receive the house, the investments, and most of the cash, with the understanding that they would use the resources to expand their programs and help other women in situations similar to mine. I also established a trust that would allow me to remain in the house for as long as I wanted, with the organization taking ownership only after my death. But more importantly, I included specific language protecting me from financial exploitation and naming Elder Haven's executive director as my advocate in any future legal or medical decisions. The signing ceremony felt like the most important moment of my life since my wedding day. Each page I initialed was another step toward freedom, another barrier between me and the people who had tried to reduce me to nothing more than a source of money and unpaid labor. When Mr. Monroe's assistant notarized the final page, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was truly in control of my own life. The counterattack began exactly 6 months later, with a phone call that came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was in my kitchen at Willow Grove, the assisted living community I had moved to shortly after changing my will, making coffee and watching the sunrise through my small window. The caller ID showed Mark's number, but I let it go to voicemail. He called again 5 minutes later, then again 5 minutes after that. By noon, he had called 16 times, each voicemail more desperate and angry than the last. The first few messages were attempts at reconciliation wrapped in guilt and manipulation. "Mom, I don't know what's gotten into you, but we need to talk. The kids are asking why Grandma won't answer her phone. You're scaring us with this behavior." As the day progressed, his tone shifted from fake concern to barely contained rage. "I don't know what lies people have been telling you, but you're making a terrible mistake. We're your family, Mom. We're the people who love you, who've always been there for you. Don't let strangers turn you against your own blood." The final message, left around dinner time, dropped all pretense of civility. "Fine, Mom. If this is how you want to play it, we can play it your way. But don't think you can just disappear and pretend we don't exist. We have rights, you know, legal rights, and we're going to exercise them if we have to." The threat was clear enough, but I wasn't intimidated. Mr. Monroe had anticipated exactly this kind of response and had prepared accordingly. The next morning brought a registered letter addressed to Mark and Tanya, delivered by a courier who waited while they signed for it. I wasn't there to see their faces when they read it, but I could imagine their shock as they absorbed the reality of their situation. The letter, written in the precise legal language that Mr. Monroe favored, informed them that my will had been revised and that they were no longer beneficiaries of my estate. It also included copies of documents I had filed with the state of Tennessee, formally notifying them that any attempt to claim undue influence or mental incompetence would be met with countersuits for attempted financial exploitation. But the real blow came in the final paragraph, which revealed that I had been documenting their behavior for months before the airport incident. Every unreturned loan, every canceled dinner, every dismissive comment had been recorded in a journal that was now safely stored in Mr. Monroe's office. The pattern of financial and emotional abuse was laid out in meticulous detail, creating a paper trail that would make any legal challenge extremely risky for them to pursue. The documentation had been Jake's idea, actually, implemented during one of our last conversations before his stroke. He had grown increasingly concerned about Mark's requests for money and Tanya's obvious disdain for me, warning that they might become more aggressive after his death. "People show you who they really are when they think no one is watching," he had said. "Start paying attention to what they do, not what they say." So I had started keeping notes, initially just to organize my own thoughts. but eventually creating a comprehensive record of their exploitation. The journal entries painted a devastating picture of systematic emotional and financial abuse. Mark's loans that were never repaid, totaling over $15,000 in the 2 years before Jake's death. Tanya's increasingly bold suggestions that I should sell the house and simplify my life, which I now understood as attempts to force me into a more manageable living situation. The gradual reduction in their visits and phone calls designed to increase my isolation and dependence on their sporadic attention. The airport abandonment was just the culmination of a long-term strategy, the final move in a game they had been playing for years. Their response to the letter was swift and predictable. Mark called 37 times over the next 3 days, leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to furious accusations. Tanya sent a series of text messages that started with fake concern, "We're worried about your mental health, Mom," and quickly devolved into outright threats. "You're going to regret this decision when you're alone and have no one to take care of you." I saved every message, forwarding them to Mr. Monroe's office as additional evidence of their character and intentions. The most telling response came in the form of an email Mark sent directly to Mr. Monroe's office, apparently believing that lawyer-to-lawyer communication would be more effective than dealing with me directly. The message was a masterpiece of self-incrimination, revealing exactly how entitled he felt to my assets and how little he understood about the legal protections I had put in place. "My mother is clearly not thinking rationally," he wrote. "She's grieving and vulnerable to outside influence. As her only son, I have a responsibility to protect her from making decisions she'll regret later. I'm asking you to delay any changes to her will until she's had time to reconsider." Mr. Monroe's response was swift and devastating. He forwarded Mark a copy of the comprehensive psychological evaluation I had undergone at his suggestion, administered by a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in capacity assessments. The evaluation confirmed what I already knew, that I was mentally competent, not suffering from dementia or depression, and fully capable of making complex financial decisions. More importantly, it documented my awareness of the risks and consequences of my choices, effectively neutering any future claims of undue influence or mental incompetence. The formal measure came exactly 1 year after the airport abandonment, on a crisp October morning that reminded me of the day Jake and I had first looked at our house. I was sitting in my sunny living room at Willow Grove, surrounded by the few possessions I had chosen to keep: Jake's favorite coffee mug, our wedding photo, a handful of books that had shaped my understanding of the world. The view from my window looked out over a garden that the residents maintained together, a riot of autumn colors that would have made Jake smile. Mr. Monroe called at precisely 10 o'clock, as we had scheduled. "It's done, Blake," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "The deed transfer was recorded this morning. Elder Haven now owns your house and property, and the investment accounts have been transferred as well. Your son and daughter-in-law have no legal claim to any of it." The finality of his words was deeply satisfying, like the sound of a door closing on a chapter of my life that had brought me nothing but pain. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was psychological. For the first time in decades, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to manage other people's emotions or expectations. The house that Mark and Tanya had probably already mentally redecorated would now serve as a transitional home for women leaving abusive situations. The garden where I had grown vegetables for Sunday dinners that went unappreciated would become a therapeutic space where elderly women could rediscover the joy of nurturing growing things. The transformation of my physical space reflected a deeper change in how I understood my own worth and purpose. At Willow Grove, I wasn't defined by my relationships to other people. I wasn't Mark's mother or Jake's widow or anyone's unpaid caregiver. I was simply Blake, a woman with her own interests, opinions, and contributions to make. I joined the book club and discovered a love for mysteries that Jake had never shared. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s, and found that my hands still remembered how to capture light and shadow on canvas. The community at Willow Grove was everything my family relationships had never been: reciprocal, respectful, and based on genuine affection rather than obligation or convenience. My neighbor Helen, a retired teacher with a wicked sense of humor, became the kind of friend I had forgotten was possible. We would sit on the front porch in the evenings, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt. Two women who had reclaimed their right to joy after decades of putting other people first. Ruth, who lived down the hall, had survived her own version of family betrayal. A daughter who had tried to have her declared incompetent so she could gain control of Ruth's finances. We bonded over our shared experience of discovering that the people who claim to love you most can sometimes be the ones most willing to exploit you. The hardest part, Ruth told me one afternoon as we worked in the community garden, isn't forgiving them for what they did. It's forgiving yourself for letting them do it for so long. Her words hit me with the force of revelation. I had been carrying guilt about my decision to cut Mark and Tanya off, questioning whether I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. But Ruth was right. The real issue wasn't their betrayal, which had been years in the making. The real issue was my own complicity, my willingness to accept less and less respect and consideration in exchange for the illusion of family connection. I had taught them how to treat me by accepting treatment that no stranger would have dared to attempt. The boundary I finally verbalized came during what would be my last conversation with Mark, a phone call that came on a snowy December evening about 18 months after I had moved to Willow Grove. I was in my kitchen making tea and watching the snow fall outside my window when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. His number had been blocked for months, but something made me pick up. His voice was different than I remembered, smaller somehow, less confident. "Mom," he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. "I know you don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Can't we find a way to work this out? Can't we be a family again?" For just a moment, I felt the old pull, the lifetime habit of rushing to comfort him, to make everything okay. Then I remembered the airport terminal, the one-way ticket, the casual cruelty of that abandonment. "Mark," I said, and my voice was steady, calm, completely sure. "You had 42 years to learn how to treat me with basic human dignity and respect. You had countless opportunities to include me, value me, consider my feelings and needs. Instead, you and Tanya chose to see me as nothing more than a source of money and unpaid labor. You chose to abandon me in an airport like I was garbage you were tired of carrying around. Those were your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences." He tried to interrupt, to offer explanations and excuses, but I wasn't interested in hearing them. "The house you thought you were going to inherit is now helping women who have been abused and abandoned by their families," I continued. "The money you were planning to spend is funding programs that give elderly people dignity and support when their own children have failed them. Your greed and cruelty have been transformed into something useful and healing. That's the only legacy you're going to get from me." The silence stretched between us for a long moment, filled with the weight of 42 years of unexamined assumptions and failed relationships. When he finally spoke, his voice was bitter, angry, all pretense of remorse abandoned. "You're going to die alone, Mom. You realize that, don't you? You're going to die alone and forgotten, and no one is going to care." I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth, not cruel but genuinely amused by his fundamental misunderstanding of my situation. "No, Mark," I said gently. "You're the one who's alone. You're the one who chose money over love, convenience over connection, entitlement over empathy. I'm surrounded by people who choose to be here, who value me for who I am rather than what I can give them. I wake up every morning in a place where I'm known and appreciated, where my voice matters, where my presence is a gift rather than a burden. You gave me the greatest favor you could have given me when you abandoned me at that airport. You freed me to discover what real family actually looks like." I hung up without saying goodbye and turned off the phone. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden in pristine white, covering the places where new growth would emerge in the spring. The next morning, I would wake up in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, responsible to people who had earned my trust and affection through their actions, rather than demanding it through accident of birth. I would have coffee with Helen and tend the plants in the community greenhouse and maybe work on the watercolor I was painting of the view from my window. The practical consequence of my decision extended far beyond the financial transfers that had stripped Mark and Tanya of their expected inheritance. Elder Haven used the resources from my estate to expand their programs significantly, opening 2 new transitional homes and hiring 3 additional social workers to help elderly people navigate situations of family abuse or abandonment. The house where I had lived with Jake became a refuge for women over 60 who needed a safe place to rebuild their lives after leaving toxic relationships or abusive living situations. But more importantly, my story became part of Elder Haven's educational outreach, a real-world example of how systematic financial and emotional abuse could be recognized, documented, and legally addressed. Mr. Monroe worked with the organization to develop workshops for elderly people and their advocates, teaching them how to identify manipulation tactics and protect themselves from exploitation. My journal entries became case studies, my experience a roadmap for other people trapped in similar situations. The micro-purpose I had chosen for my life was simple but profound: to demonstrate that dignity and self-worth don't have expiration dates, that it's never too late to demand better treatment from the people who claim to love you, and that family is defined by behavior rather than biology. Every day I spent at Willow Grove, every friendship I built, every moment of joy I experienced, was a rebuke to the people who had tried to convince me that I was nothing more than an inconvenience waiting to die. I kept Jake's coffee mug on my kitchen counter, using it every morning as I had my first cup of tea and planned my day. Sometimes I would tell him about the garden we were planning for spring, or the book I was reading, or the way Helen had made me laugh until I cried the day before. I knew he would approve of the choice I had made, would be proud that I had finally learned to value myself as much as I had always valued other people. The house that Mark and Tanya had coveted became a symbol of transformation rather than inheritance. Its rooms filled with women who were learning that they deserved better than they had accepted. Its garden growing vegetables that would nourish people who truly appreciated the gift. Every meal cooked in that kitchen, every conversation held in that living room, every night of peaceful sleep in those bedrooms was a testament to the power of choosing dignity over convenience, respect over familiarity, authentic connection over the hollow obligations of blood relation. In the end, the greatest gift I gave myself wasn't the financial security or the legal protections or even the comfortable life at Willow Grove. It was the knowledge that I had finally learned to recognize my own worth, to demand treatment that matched my value as a human being, and to walk away from people who couldn't or wouldn't provide it. I was 72 years old when I finally understood that being alone was infinitely preferable to being with people who made me feel worthless. That chosen family was far more valuable than biological family that saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The snow outside my window continued to fall as I finished my tea and prepared for bed, covering the ground with the promise of new beginnings, fresh starts, and the endless possibility of growth and change that exists at every stage of life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, new opportunities to choose myself over the expectations of others, new moments to appreciate the freedom that comes from living authentically, rather than trying to manage other people's emotions and demands. I had traded the prison of other people's expectations for the boundless landscape of my own choices, and I had never been happier to be exactly where I was. Sometimes the greatest gift life gives us is the courage to choose ourselves over others' expectations. And that was today's story from my heart to yours. If it touched you in some way, please subscribe. I have so many more stories to share with you.